Hi everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today we have a return guest. He is Mr. Samuel Andreyev. I already had him on the show to talk about music. I titled the video Music Across Times and Cultures, and so you can go back and see it. I will leave a link in the description box for it. It's really interesting. So just to give a quick introduction again for people who are not familiar with him, Mr. Samuel Andreyev is a Canadian music composer and writer residing now in France, and he also has a YouTube channel with the same name, Samuel Andreyev. So Mr. Andreyev, thank you again for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Okay, so last time we talked a little bit about music after the interview, and we decided that it could be fun to have a second interview, but now much more focused on the philosophy of music. And so I would like to start by this question. All people, all human beings, of course, can appreciate music. So would you say that someone who hasn't studied music in a formal way, or is not someone that produces music, can also have a saying in the quality of a given music piece, for example?
Yeah, okay, so I'll answer that in two ways. So the first is that I'm not actually sure that everybody can appreciate music.
Oh.
And yeah, well, it's an interesting thing. There's something called just musicality, the quality of being a musical person. And some people don't really seem to have it. They don't respond as much to music. They don't have as good an ear, maybe. It's a very mysterious thing, because I've done a lot of teaching, and I've had the opportunity to work with some very young people as well. And when someone's musically gifted, you can just see it immediately. It's very interesting. One of the qualities of being musically gifted is that you can, for example, remember a melody very easily and sing it back or play it back on an instrument. And so with some people, it's extremely hard for them to do that. They don't seem to have that natural ability. And I've noticed also that you do get people who are just naturally very responsive to music. They hear it and they're really enthusiastic about it. They enjoy it. They want to know more about it. It makes them curious. And some people, where they're kind of indifferent, you put a piece of music on and it's almost like they don't really notice it. You know, like it's sort of on in the background, but it sort of stops there. So I would certainly say that there's a very variable degree of appreciation, just natural ability maybe to appreciate the musical phenomenon in and of itself amongst people. So, you know, I've met people who just completely are not interested in music. It's a very interesting thing. It's rare, I think, to be completely uninterested in it, but there are people like that. So I'm not sure it's quite as universal as that. But your second question, or the second part of your question rather, was, is it necessary to have a musical education in order to appreciate certain types of music? And I would say that it's difficult to answer that question in general terms, because it really depends on the person and it depends on the type of music. I would say that there are types of music that are more easily accessible. That I think anyone would agree with. There are certain types of music that a broader range of the public can appreciate without any particular effort. So in other words, you play the piece for them and they can immediately more or less understand it. That's what pop music does, and most commercial music. It's predicated on the idea that you're using a common language, right? The music is based on things that are already familiar to a broad range of the public. So if you hear a new pop song, you're not going to be challenged by it necessarily, in most cases, right? It's going to be built off of things that are already a familiar part of the cultural landscape. So for example, if you hear a new Britney Spears song for the first time, your immediate reaction isn't going to be, I have to take a couple of weeks to try to understand this piece, right? It's immediate, and everybody can sort of understand it on some level. So, but there are also types of music that are more specialized or that maybe demand a different sort of listening. So music that is predicated on easy accessibility, on the idea that, you know, it's built upon things that are already familiar, it's not going to take the same effort to listen to. So you can sit down, you can listen to it, you can get something out of it. Obviously, if you listen more intently and more closely and more critically, you'll probably hear more things in it. But on a base level, it's not going to be a real challenge. And then there are other types of music where you do need to make more of an effort sometimes. And those sorts of musics tend to have a more specialized audience. So one thing that I'll say about that, coming off of that point, is that in the 19th century, it was still possible to speak of something called the audience, in quotes. The audience being presumably the sort of bourgeois middle class audience for things like the symphony and the opera and that sort of thing. And you could sort of speak of that as though it were a relatively homogeneous entity, where if you spoke of the contemporary audience in Paris, for example, in the 1890s, everyone would more or less know what you were talking about. I would say, though, that in the 20th and especially now in the 21st century, the concept of the audience per se doesn't really hold as well. Instead, you have multiple audiences, and they tend to be fairly specialized. So on the one hand, there is still an opera audience. Certainly, there's an audience for symphonic music. There's an audience for rap music. There's an audience for hip hop. There's an audience for blues-based music, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes these different audiences overlap, and sometimes they don't. And so what you're getting is kind of a more specialized form of listening, perhaps, which I think is a result of just the sheer availability of music, the fact that you can get an enormous variety of music at your fingertips through services like Spotify. And so what tends to happen is a lot of people tend to cluster towards the things that they are the most comfortable with or that they enjoy the most, and they really can dig deep into those particular things. So instead of having a broad understanding of everything that's happening in a given culture musically, what you tend to have now, I think, are audiences that are a little bit more specific.
Sure, I understand. But okay, would you say that, for example, if we were to have two people and both of them were innately highly musical, let's say, but one of them went through as well music education and the second person didn't, would you say that if those two people that were highly musical, but one of them formally trained as a musician and the second not, that if we were to ask them to criticize a piece of music, that the critiques that they could produce would be of equal value?
Okay, so that's an interesting question. It's a complicated one because I think there's two factors. So one of them is that it's certainly true that if you have a broad musical education, in other words, you're familiar with the language of music, you're familiar with the history of music especially, because that's also very important, then what that means is you can listen to a much broader range of things and have some understanding of them in terms of where they're coming from historically and what they mean and what the composer is trying to do. However, there's also a second aspect which is also very important and can't be neglected, which is simply the psychological trait of openness. So no matter how musically educated you are, there may very well be things that you simply don't enjoy or that you're not interested in listening to or that you might not even consider as being music simply because you're perhaps not as open-minded as the next person. So that's another question. And by the way, I'm not saying...
Sorry, just to interrupt you there. Would you say that that trait that has to do with trait openness, because it's one of the big five you're talking about right here, the trait openness to experience, would you say that it has to do more with intellectualism or the way people process emotions that are related to music?
Well, it's a trait that I think is independent of things like intelligence and openness to emotional experience. I think it's a little bit different. I would say that it's just a quality that makes people more susceptible, first of all, more curious, perhaps, to hear a broad range of things, and more susceptible to listen to things, perhaps, before judging them immediately, and perhaps more willing also to listen to them multiple times. So, and that's not, incidentally, a value judgment by any means, because there are conservative listeners that have excellent taste, and there are very open-minded people who have terrible taste. So it's not a question of that. But there certainly are people who are perhaps more willing to try out something that they've never experienced before and to delay judging it as long as possible. right? Whereas an audience that's more conservative will tend to hear something that's really new, that's really unfamiliar to them, and they'll tend to have an a priori judgment on it and say, okay, this is not for me. I already know that it's not for me, and I just want to go back to the thing that's familiar. So that's something that I don't know that you can necessarily do all that much about it, you know, because you can't fundamentally change someone's personality, especially when they're older. So what I try to do with my own channel is simply to lay out what it was that a particular composer was attempting to do in their piece. I put it in a historical and an aesthetic context so that you can see that it's not an isolated phenomenon, but that it's related to other things that are happening, perhaps culturally, perhaps politically, perhaps aesthetically at the same time. And then I simply walk you through the piece so that you can see how it's put together, what the composer is trying to do, etc. And so sometimes that can really be helpful, because there are people, I very often get emails from people who say, I want to explore music in a broader fashion, but I have no idea where to begin. And that's a completely understandable sentiment, because music is like an ocean. It's absolutely gigantic. And there are so many things now, especially in the 21st century, that fall under the umbrella term of music that 100 years ago probably would not have been appreciated as being music at all. So when you enter into an ocean, obviously it's very difficult to get your bearings and to get a sense of what's happening and sort of narrow it down to something that you can actually deal with, right? Because if you are to enter into a vast, unordered, and completely chaotic ocean of possibilities, then first of all, it's going to be very hard for you to make value judgments, and audiences hate that. They hate when they hear something and they have no idea whether it's good or not. Well, most audiences anyway. Maybe some people find that exciting. But often, if they can't tell if it's good or not, then it sort of makes them a little bit anxious. So I think one thing that can be extremely helpful is just to have, you know, a discussion with somebody who is knowledgeable about the broader picture of what's happening in music and can sort of help to just situate things and say, okay, this isn't some completely random, isolated cultural artifact. It's connected to this and it's connected to that. You have to connect it to things that are already familiar to them so that they can see that it's actually coming out of something broader and larger, so that they can connect it to something that they're already familiar with. And that tends to really help, I find.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that for someone to reflect on music, to do philosophy of music, or even to criticize music properly, that that person should be exposed to as large a variety of cultures and places with music as possible, and that would be something that would enrich his or her process of evaluating music?
Well, I think if you're going to evaluate music as a general phenomenon, then yes, you absolutely need to be familiar with the music of other cultures, because one of the things that teaches you, and it teaches it actually very, very well and very quickly, is that different cultures have wildly different approaches to music. And so in Western cultures, I think if you were to stop a random person on the street and ask them what their definition of music is, they would probably say something like, it's got to have a melody, it's got to have harmony, chords of some kind, it's got to have rhythm, etc., etc. But if you were to look at the music of other cultures, you can find examples very easily of types of music where there's no harmony. So for example, a lot of Southern Indian music has a very ornamented, very complicated melodic line, but it doesn't really have harmony. It might have a drone that accompanies the melody, but you don't really have chords. So chords are, or the idea of harmony and polyphony in a certain sense is really specific to a lot of Western music. That's not to say you don't get it in other cultures, but I would say that it's the dimension of music that the West has probably developed the most. And so there are other cultures where the emphasis is much more on rhythm, where it's much more on melody, etc., etc. So the attributes that an average Westerner might consider to be fundamental to music might be completely unimportant in another culture. So then that makes you start to wonder about, well, what do all of these things have in common as phenomena? So if my definition of music is completely different from the music that you can hear in a certain region of China, for example, or in a certain region of the Middle East, etc., then what can you extract out as being common features to all of these cultures that sort of explain the musical phenomenon? Because it's really not a simple task.
Right. And it's interesting because you just went through some of the topics that we elaborated a bit more on our first conversation. Particularly, you talked about the fact that music has this sort of relativistic trait across cultures because it is not really always harmonic or repetitive and things like that. But I think that there's also another trait that people tend to associate with music and say that it's a feature of music that we didn't address last time. That is, many people say that or classify music as being organized sound. But I think that one problem with while trying to classify music as that is that human speech, at least, is also organized sound. So that definition wouldn't distinguish music from other things that people produce, right?
Yes, but music and speech are very closely related, though. They're extremely related as phenomena, and you could certainly make the case that music is an outgrowth of the phenomenon of speech. And so, for example, if you look at highly stylized poetry from the classical period, for example, you have a certain cadence to it. You have a meter. You have a rhythm, a very strong rhythm that's associated with it. You have a very careful selection of consonants and plosives and vowels and all of that, so that you have organized sound elements plus rhythm in a good piece of classical poetry. And so the only real difference, I suppose, with a piece of classical music is that you don't have the pitch. You don't have the pitch aspect, but it's got a form. It's got organized sonic elements. It's got rhythm. So it's extremely close to the phenomenon of music. And I would say that the concept of melody in music also comes directly from speech. So in a melody, what you have are fixed pitches. In other words, a note that you can give a name to, so B flat, A, G sharp, etc. And in a melody, that sort of succession of pitches rises and descends, etc. So you have some kind of a melodic movement within the succession of notes. And what a melody really is, I mean, most of the time it's something that you can relate directly to the voice. So if you could at least theoretically imagine singing it, then it's got some connection to the voice, then it's probably something that you're going to consider as being melodic. But there are other aspects of music, so rhythm, for example, or percussion. And there are cultures that have really developed percussion to a very large degree. And sometimes that percussion doesn't use pitches at all. It's what you call unpitched percussion. But that's still music. So some music has a strong connection to the voice, and some music doesn't. And when it doesn't have a connection to the voice, it usually has a connection to the body, to the sorts of movements that you make when you're with your body, when you're walking, for example, or when you're running. So these sorts of things. And so the music becomes almost a kind of metaphor for a body moving in space. And in the same sense that melody is kind of an extension and elaboration of just natural speech patterns.
Okay, perhaps there are people that would say at this point that in order for us to think about music and do philosophy of music, we have to distinguish music as an object of study from at least the other forms of art. So what would you say that we should say are the distinct features that music have that distinguish it from other forms of art?
Right, okay, so the first thing is that it exists in the domain of culture and not in the domain of nature, okay, because this is a cultural product. So people talk about birdsong and say that it's music, and I completely understand that, and you can appreciate it on a musical level, certainly, and it has a lot in common with music produced by humans. But fundamentally, I don't think you can really consider it as music if you want to consider music as being a cultural phenomenon. So that's one thing. Another thing is that one thing that I think you can say without too much difficulty is a universal feature of music is that it involves sound. And it involves sound that is organized in some manner or another. So it's not simply a chaotic succession of sounds that have no connection to one another. It's sounds that have been deliberately chosen or at least put into a particular context and that context has to exist within a cultural space of some kind. And then the next thing I would say is that the dimension of time is extremely important. So in order to have sounds and movement, because movement is a fundamental aspect of music as well. Like a music that were completely static, where you just had, for example, one sound that didn't move and just sort of went on forever without ever changing, I think that it would be very difficult to consider that as being music, because for me personally, movement is an absolutely fundamental notion of music. The idea that you are starting here and you end up there, and that you get from A to B via some sort of process of movement. I think that's fairly fundamental. So in order to have movement, you have to have the dimension of time. So I would say sound and movement in the dimension of time, and it has to exist within a cultural sphere. That would be my personal definition. Although, you know, it's possible to argue with that, and different people have offered different definitions. So, for example, the Italian composer Luciano Berio has said that the definition of music is anything that you listen to with the intention of listening to music is music. So, you know, there are other possible definitions, but that would be mine.
Mm-hmm. Okay, sure. Okay, and an interesting aspect of music is that it usually doesn't come isolated from other performative aspects of how music is exposed to people, let's say, because I mean, usually it has to be performed by other people in a certain way. So how should we evaluate, perhaps firstly, what are the performative aspects of music?
Okay, that's a very good question. So one of the particularities of music is this notion of the composer. So the composer is somebody who writes a piece of music in the form of a document using symbols on paper arranged in a certain order. And then, but that's not yet music. It isn't really music until somebody performs it and brings it to life. So that's an unusual thing as far as the arts go. I suppose you could say there's a parallel with a stage piece, for example, with a piece of theater, where you have a playwright who produces a play, but it has to be brought to life by the actors. But in other forms of art, in literature, for example, or in painting, you have a much more direct connection between the production of the work itself and then the reception of that work by an audience. You don't really have this intermediary stage in the same way. You could argue that something like an art gallery or a publisher is a kind of intermediary stage, but it's not really comparable in my view, because the musician, the person who performs the piece, it's not a neutral thing. It's not as though you just take a piece of written down music and play it just by reading the notes, because the performer also has a certain culture, they have a certain sensibility, they have a certain way of playing that's also going to condition the way that the piece is played. That's why, for example, if you take a random example, if you take Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, there's going to be 200 different recordings you can buy of that piece, and they're all going to be a little bit different. You know, no two are going to be identical, and that's because the performer has a certain degree of agency in terms of how the music comes about, exactly. So in music you have this peculiar situation where you have this figure of the composer, and then on the other hand you have this figure of the performer. So I should qualify that by saying that there are lots of types of music where those two roles are conflated, where it's one and the same person. So you have the person who creates the music is the same as the person who plays it. So in the Baroque period, for example, you had a long history of traveling virtuosi, so performers who were extremely gifted at their instrument, who wrote pieces for themselves to play, and they simply traveled across Europe, usually presenting their work in courts and things like that, and they would play their own pieces. And so they would write pieces that were specifically tailored to their own abilities. So there's lots of examples of composers like that. So Paganini is a good example, or Franz Liszt is another one, these sort of virtuoso performer composers. So these days, in the 21st century, there seem to be a little bit fewer of those sorts of people. The tasks have become a little bit more cloistered and a little bit more specialized, which I think is an unfortunate thing. I think ideally you would have a composer and a performer, and they sort of they sort of go together. I think that's an ideal situation. And then, of course, there's another category, which is that of folk music. So folk music is also very interesting because it's kind of like a collective property. It doesn't really belong to anyone. The issue of authorship is kind of left out of it in a certain sense because they're kind of collective creations. And so you have these pieces of music that are just sort of understood by a certain population, and you can do endless variations on them. They're extremely elastic, right? You can do all sorts of things with them and still have them be recognizable as some sort of a variation on that original piece. So when you have a piece of folk music, it's endlessly being reinterpreted and recreated by the sort of ordinary people that are performing it. And that's a truly sort of collaborative situation where you don't exactly have an author, you don't exactly have a division between the composer and the performer.
Right. And I think that one of the performative aspects of music that people tend to pay a lot of attention to, lay people and professional musicians as well, I think has to do with the emotional aspect of it, because it's very easy for people even if they don't know how they tell it, if they don't know how to explain how they get at it, it's very easy for people to say that the way the performer tried to convey a certain emotion didn't really work, and that there's something weird going around there, and there's not a sort of congruency between the piece of music and how it was performed and the emotion it tried to convey. So what would you say about this?
Okay, very interesting question. So there's a couple of ways that you can answer that. So one of them is that you might want to look at why people listen to music in the first place. And I would say at a certain level, it's in order to change their state, really. A lot of what musical experience is, I think, is a kind of, it's a form of transcendence, ultimately. I don't think it's too far from a sort of religious or spiritual experience in that sense, and that you want to connect with something that is outside of you and that is bigger than you, and that sort of allows you perhaps to transcend the everyday and engage with something that is far more powerful and abstract, I would say, at the same time. And that applies to a very broad range of music, incidentally. It's not a question of sort of lofty classical music on the one hand and sort of low-level commercial music on the other, because first of all, I think that distinction is very difficult to make, because there's a very blurry line actually between the two. And on the other hand, there are certainly forms of commercial music that clearly have that effect on people, where if you go to a rock concert, for example, there's a kind of mass ecstasy that's happening in many cases, which is extremely interesting. So why do people listen to music? It's in order to change their state, to experience something powerful, I think, that in some manner or another improves and or enriches their experience. And I think that if it doesn't do that on some level, then it's going to be probably a waste of time for the person that they'll probably experience it as a waste of time. But the second part of the question really is that it's complicated, because you might well ask, if somebody's listening to a piece and they can't engage with it and they don't enjoy it and it doesn't affect them emotionally, is there something wrong with the piece? Or is there something wrong with their sensibility that they can't appreciate the piece? And the answer really is in between, of course, because on the one hand, you have this piece of music, which is an external object, and it's sort of having an effect on this person. And the person obviously has their own unique range of experience and their own sensibility and their own tastes that have been formed by their experiences. And so they're going to be applying that sort of perceptual filter to bear on whatever it is that they hear. So on one hand, you could say that the actual piece itself doesn't exist in some abstract realm as a sort of perfect detached object. The piece, you have to think of it phenomenologically. The piece exists in the space that is midway between the piece itself and the person who's listening to it, right? So you have to look at the experience of listening that the person is having, and not only at the piece itself, because you can't think of these as being two sort of separate domains, where you have on the one hand the subject, and on the other hand you have this sort of this sort of perfect abstract object that's just sort of floating in its own abstraction. It's not like that. You have a space where the two meet, and that I think really is where the piece exists. And that's going to be different not only from person to person, but also with the same person listening to the same piece on multiple occasions, which is extremely interesting because, for example, I've had this experience many times, and maybe you have as well, where I'll be listening to a piece and I can't enjoy it for whatever reason. I'm not in the mood. It's not the right piece for me. I don't know that it's, maybe it's not, I don't think it's very good at that particular moment. And then 2 years later, I'll come back to it again for whatever reason. I'll hear it a second time, and I'm hearing a completely different piece. Not because the piece has changed, but because I have in the meantime. So it's a complicated phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's very interesting. And do you think that to properly evaluate a piece of music, that we can really evaluate it by itself, or that we can't really separate it from its performance, from the way it is performed?
Well, that's the difficulty of being a music critic. So, for example, first of all, it's different. It's different whether you're listening to, for example, a symphonic concert as opposed to a CD of music that's been recorded. Is two very different things, because the CD on the one hand is a more stable object. It has a certain permanence to it, right? So you can listen to a CD 300 times and it's the same CD. It's the same recordings in the same order, etc. Whereas a concert is a unique event that can't really be duplicated. You can make a film of it, you can record it, and so on, but the experience of sitting there in the concert hall listening to a piece of music is a unique experience fundamentally. So one thing that's very, very difficult, I think, is when you're hearing a new piece of music for the first time in a concert hall, nobody knows, first of all, nobody has the slightest idea what the experience of the piece is going to be like until they've actually listened to it. So when you're hearing something completely new for the first time, you don't know which way is up and which way is down. You have no bearings. You can't really orient yourself. So what you're doing really is you're figuring out what the piece is as you go along. And in a certain sense, you only really know what the piece is retroactively. Because when you're sitting there listening to the piece, you have a very reduced time horizon, right? You're focusing on little individual moments, because that's about what you can handle in terms of your perception. You can't think of the overall form of the whole piece when you're listening to it for the first time. And then retroactively, you can sort of build a mental map of the piece, so to speak, where you can say, oh yes, okay, so this happened, and then this happened, and there were sections, and then it was this long, and so on. And then you can sort of start to have a kind of mental landscape of the piece that you heard. But as you're listening to it, that's impossible. And so the other thing is, when you're listening to a piece for the first time that you never heard before, and nobody else has heard it before either, then the experience of listening to the performance of the piece and listening to the abstract work of art that the composer has created are one and the same. You can't separate the two. So if it's a bad performance, or if it's not a convincing performance, you have no idea really if it's the fault of the piece or if it's the fault of the performance. Now, you might have some ability to guess, right? Because maybe the performer on stage is someone that you really know and trust, and you know that they're a really good performer, and you're willing to go along with them on whatever adventure it is. And you hear the piece and you can't stand it, and you think, okay, well, probably it wasn't their fault because I know they're a really good performer. Or conversely, there might be a composer whose work you're already a little bit familiar with, and you kind of know where they're at stylistically, and you hear their new piece and it doesn't really do it for you. Is it the fault of the performance? Is it the fault of the piece? You might be more inclined to say, well, it's probably not the composer's fault because I know they're doing really good work. So maybe it wasn't the best performance. But you don't really know for sure until you've seen that musical object in multiple dimensions. And so what I mean by that is, ideally, you want to hear it multiple times. You want to hear it performed by different people. And this is the great advantage, incidentally, that classical music has over contemporary music, is that, I cited the example of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony earlier. That piece has been performed thousands of times, tens of thousands of times probably, and there's hundreds of recordings available. So, through a process of sort of historical selection and gradual refinement, we can say, as a culture, we can say, well, there's a sort of broad consensus that these are the 4 or 5 most remarkable recordings of that piece. And we can pull them out, and you can be reasonably sure that those are quality recordings. And that if you're hearing that particular piece played by this orchestra on this recording, then it's probably going to be, you know, a good experience at least. Whereas with a new piece of music that's not been tested, nobody knows about it, you can't do that. It's impossible. So the audience that's going to sit down and listen to a new piece of music, they're taking a risk. There's just no way around that. You can't be safe in that situation in a certain sense. You're taking a risk. You might not like it. It might not be a good performance. It might not be a good piece. And you have no way of knowing that in advance.